Hello and welcome back. I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Let's first take a look at our top stories. Hamas say they have agreed to release 10 hostages as part of a Gaza ceasefire deal currently being negotiated. However, talks have not yet led to a concrete deal. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the US and Israel have a common goal as strikes in Gaza reportedly kill dozens. Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities have been under a bombardment overnight, with at least 2 deaths and several injuries reported by local officials. This comes just a day after Ukraine reported that Russia launched its largest drone attack of the war so far. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has met with US envoy Keith Kellogg in Rome, discussing weapons and potential sanctions on Russia. It comes as US officials confirmed that artillery shells and missiles are being sent to Ukraine. US President Donald Trump has announced a reciprocal tariff set to be imposed on Brazil, going from 10% to 50%. Trump's tariff order, effective on August the 1st, came in a letter to President Lula, where he slammed what he called a witch hunt trial of former President Jair Bolsonaro. The US Embassy says that the Yemen-based Houthis have kidnapped mariners from a ship that they attacked in the Red Sea. 15 people remain missing after the Iran-backed group continued attacks on shipping in the region amid wider regional tensions. The United Kingdom and France are set to coordinate nuclear deterrence against potential threats as the two European countries pledge nuclear cooperation. French President Emmanuel Macron wraps up his state visit with this defence pact. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto have held bilateral talks in Brazil, looking to expand ties. The leaders have also agreed to collaborate on developing missile tech and submarine systems. And a judge has maintained the block on a Republican-crafted law which made it a crime for illegal immigrants to enter Florida. The justices denied a request by state officials to lift a lower court order. We start this hour in the Middle East, and President Donald Trump says a ceasefire deal in Gaza could be close, following back-to-back meetings with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Trump also hinted at recent high-level talks involving US, Israeli and Qatari officials. As negotiations intensify, the White House signals optimism that a hostage and ceasefire agreement may be reached soon. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he and President Trump share a common goal to free hostages and end Hamas rule in Gaza. Speaking after their second meeting, Netanyahu said both leaders want a deal, but not at any cost. He emphasised full coordination, not coercion. Trump's envoy says only one major issue remains in ceasefire talks. Netanyahu also rejected claims of forced Palestinian removal, saying it's about choice, not displacement. Here is what the Israeli president had to say.
I completed a second meeting with President Trump. I want to inform you something that will shock the various reports that come out. President Trump and I have a common goal. I want to achieve the release of our hostages. We want to end Hamas rule in Gaza. We want to make sure that Gaza does not pose a threat to Israel anymore.
Well, of course, the situation in Gaza continues to be a talking point across the globe, with geopolitical conversations taking place. Joining us to discuss them is Jordan Cope, a Middle East expert who's joining us from Erfurt in Germany. Jordan, thank you as always for being here. Let's look at this US-Israeli cooperation as work towards a ceasefire deal continues. How important is it that the US and Israel are aligned in putting pressure on a potential ceasefire deal?
It's very important that Israel ultimately agrees at the end of the day. This is an agreement that will be critical for Israel's future security. It's also important to note that over the many years, Hamas has violated every ceasefire that has ever existed. So Israel will know that if Hamas tends to stay in power, it will be a serious, significant security concern for Israel in the future, and one that Israel will struggle to accept. We have had so many close calls over the past many months in terms of being so close to forging and finalizing ceasefire agreements, but the same problem remains, which is there are 50 hostages that remain in the Gaza Strip, half of whom are believed to be dead. And Israel ultimately knows just how difficult fighting wars in the Gaza Strip can be. And it remains crucial for Israel to be able to secure the release of all of those hostages, to bring them back home, to ensure that Hamas is not in power, given that Hamas has committed itself to committing future October 7th attacks again and again. Israel ultimately knows that this ceasefire could be perhaps one of the last if the US pressures it to stop any future fighting. And so for the sake of its citizens, whom it is tasked to protect, making sure that it gets every hostage home will surely remain a key provision of any future ceasefire agreement.
Yes, Jordan, stay with us. Let's look at those talks that are ongoing. Hamas say that these discussions remain tough, blaming Israeli intransigence for the stalemate. Key issues still on the table include the flow of aid into Gaza, complete withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Strip, and strong guarantees for a permanent ceasefire. Despite the challenges, Hamas has agreed to release 10 hostages as part of the ongoing negotiations. The move comes amid renewed international pressure to end the war. Talks are intensifying in Doha, but officials say significant gaps remain. Efforts continue to reach a breakthrough and stop the bloodshed after nearly 2 years of relentless fighting. Well, Jordan, thank you for staying with us. Of course, stuff to unpack here. Firstly, let's look at the fact that Hamas say that they're willing to do a partial hostage release. This, of course, coming after months since the last hostage release and since fighting resumed. How significant is this, not just for the Israeli government, but the Israeli people, of course, who have suffered with up to 250 hostages taken after those October 7th attacks?
Well, of course, every Israeli life saved will be considered a victory by part of the Israeli public. However, much of the Israeli public will certainly consider it a continuing aggravation if not all of the hostages are released and Hamas is not ejected from power. The reason that there has been such a struggle to forge a ceasefire agreement is because Hamas knows that the longer it can keep this war going, the better it can be at its attempt to delegitimize Israel and ultimately pursue its later goal, which is to destroy Israel, which Hamas has made very clear is one of its key goals in its charter. And so what Israel ultimately hopes to do is probably something reasonable, such as ensuring that Hamas's leaders are expelled out of the Gaza Strip and that its leadership is no more in the Gaza Strip. There are many competing factions currently in the Gaza Strip for power right now, militias such as the Abu Shabaab militia, and with Israel closing in on nearly being able to be in control of 75% of the Gaza Strip, Hamas realizes that its bargaining power is becoming less and less. However, if it can still keep the hostages out of Israel's reach for as long as possible, it can in part legitimize itself in a perverse way as being the leading actor when it comes to Islamist resistance and terrorism in the Gaza Strip, confusing Israel, bamboozling Israel. And so Israel ultimately, in order to demonstrate that Hamas is on its last legs, it needs to guarantee that Hamas is out of the Gaza Strip.
Yes, and you've alluded slightly to my next question there, but Hamas saying that gaps still remain. Can you detail more of what Israel is looking for? We obviously know Hamas is looking for a permanent end to this conflict, but what are Benjamin Netanyahu's key aims as his administration goes into these discussions in direct talks in Doha?
It's important to note that the conversations recently with Netanyahu and President Trump in DC were actually behind closed doors. And so it's definitely a bit more confusing and maybe not quite as transparent, the rumors currently circulating regarding the negotiations behind the ceasefire and those that are happening right now in Doha. However, one should be aware that Qatar is a mastermind when it comes to forging deals that ultimately benefit the interests of Islamist parties, and Hamas is one of its greatest beneficiaries, having received approximately $2 billion since 2012. Hamas ultimately receives about $30 million a month from Qatar, and Qatar ultimately has an interest in ensuring that it remains in power. So while Qatar ultimately feigns an interest in the United States and a feigned friendship, what it has ultimately done over the past few decades is ultimately undermine the US at the same time. It might offer the United States a military base in Qatar, but it will certainly also regulate where and when the US can and cannot attack. And so surely, even though it is feigning a persona as an unbiased, objective mediator, Qatar also has its interest at hand in ensuring that Hamas remains in power. After all, Hamas's leadership, much of it still remains in Qatar. And if Qatar ultimately wanted to help bring this war about to an end, it could have expelled Hamas's leadership, it could have cut funding to Hamas, and it ultimately chose not to. So the big gaps, going back to your question, that probably remain, will ultimately be making sure that Hamas is ejected from the Gaza Strip, ensuring all of the hostages returning home. Hamas will probably want to make sure that it remains in power and that Israel ultimately withdraws from all of the Gaza Strip, and hence it will present that as a victory, one so perverse, but nevertheless one that Hamas will use to legitimize its sustained and continued rule.
Yes, Jordan, we're going to look at the devastation that has been caused by the hostages that are held in Gaza by Hamas shortly, but I do want to talk about the humanitarian situation ongoing in the Gaza Strip. Hospital officials saying that on Wednesday, 40 Palestinians killed in Israeli strikes. Of course, not all of these affiliated with Hamas. Is there more pressure, do you think, on a ceasefire now because global opinion on the conflict and global diplomacy around the humanitarian situation that's being reported as famine by many groups is continuing for another month and affecting millions of displaced people in the enclave?
The argument regarding famine has been rebutted time and time again throughout the war. The war is indeed tragic. Civilians have died. But even amidst one of the most recent bouts of violence in a very densely populated urban area, as military expert John Spencer has noted, it's been one of the most humane wars that has been conducted in terms of the lengths Israel's gone to provide humanitarian aid. The aid that Israel's allowed in has actually been higher than it was before the war. On top of that, providing millions of warnings, whether it be evacuation notices, whether it be warning noises on top of buildings, millions of phone calls issued to try to save as many civilians as possible. When it comes to the pressure that Israel will be feeling in this war and the pressure to stop, it will ultimately be coming from its ally in the United States and from President Trump, who has his own interest in seeing this war come to an end, in the sense that Donald Trump will ultimately want to advance the Abraham Accords. And it's very possible that there might be some countries lurking in the scenes waiting for this war to end so they can therefore justify renewed or even new ties with Israel based on security agreements, perhaps based on water or technology or pharmaceutical agreements that will benefit them in the near future. So while this war is indeed devastating, and while this war has involved civilian deaths, just as every war does, it's also important to take into account the efforts that Israel has gone to spare civilians in urban warfare. And as the UN notes, in modern day warfare, 90% of all casualties in modern day warfare are often civilians. And it looks like Israel, even when using Hamas's debunked statistics, that have time and time again tried to make it seem that the civilian casualties are even higher. it seems that Israel is still outperforming modern democracies and modern day warfare in terms of sparing civilian lives.
Jordan, but very quickly before we move on, I just want to look at your claim there regarding aid and Israel letting in more aid. In recent weeks, 130 NGOs and charities called for the halting of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, US-backed, with, of course, support from Israel. And there have been reports that have been backed up about killings around these aid centres. So I just want to pose that to you and ask you where your sources are in terms of relating to this amount of aid that is going in when so many are saying there is a famine. You're providing one source, but could you back that up a little bit more?
Sure. So going back to this source that more aid has actually come in, Naftali Bennett, the former Prime Minister of Israel, who recently ousted Netanyahu, was actually responsible for helping raise awareness to other statistics, such as the 1.7 million tons of aid having come in this war, which apparently is even higher than the aid that was allowed before the war began. And if you look at those 130 NGOs, many of them often are affiliated with reports renowned for anti-Israel bias. If I recall, Amnesty International was one of those orgs that signed on, which not only has systemic problems of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias within its ranks. I encourage you to read an article I wrote for the Jerusalem Post a while, as an opinion piece in the Jerusalem Post a while back. But on top of that, if you look at open source information technology, you can simply see many Gaza grocery stores and restaurants completely replete with food. The problem is not so much the food going in, it's the problem is with Hamas all too often monopolizing the supplies, trying to sell them at higher rates when they should be distributed for free. And that's exactly why the Gaza Humanitarian Fund was established, to make sure that they could circumvent Hamas, its efforts to monopolize aid distribution and to kill civilians who line up for the Gaza Humanitarian Fund. Hamas is ultimately trying to dehumanize and delegitimize these programs currently ongoing in the Gaza Strip, because it's an effort to circumvent from Hamas's power and to make sure that Hamas doesn't monopolize rule over the people and their critical resources. And so people are getting aid in the Gaza Strip. Unfortunately, though, at the same time, Hamas is making it very expensive for some in the Gaza Strip. So there are a few facts, hopefully, to aid the information that you wanted.
Yes, Jordan, thank you for providing that information. If you stay with us, we're going to stay in the Gaza Strip. Israel's military chief says conditions are now in place to advance a hostage deal in Gaza. Chief Eyal Zamir claims the army has dealt a major blow to Hamas's governance and military strength. He says Israel's operational power has paved the way for progress in ongoing indirect talks to secure hostage releases. Let's listen to what he's had to say.
הגענו להישגים רבים ומשמעותיים. פגענו קשות ביכולותיו השלטוניות והצבאיות של חמאס, ובזכות העוצמה המבצעית שהפגענו, נוצרו התנאים לקידום עסקה לשחרור.
Well, Jordan, thank you for staying with us. I mentioned a short while ago we're going to look now at the potential release of hostages. Of course, since that initial ceasefire, which concluded after its first phase, no releases of hostages as we saw during that time. How significant is it for the people of Israel if this does go through and 10 hostages are released in that moment? What will it mean to the people of Israel?
I think it will be very critical. Israel, of course, celebrates all hostages who come home. The recent celebration of Idon Alexander, an American citizen that Trump helped rescue and bring home to Israel, was considered a beautiful milestone amongst the Israeli public. Much of the Israeli public does want this war to end, but they also understand the dangers of the costs that could occur if the costs are simply too high. And so what's important to note is that while Israel wants to bring about every hostage home, it also wants to make sure that October 7th style attacks don't happen again and again, as Hamas has committed itself to. Going back to a recent claim I made, a few of the other orgs that were mentioned in those 130 include Save the Children and Oxfam, organizations that are affiliated often with anti-Israel bias, and many who do appreciate UN programs that have often been accused of anti-Israel bias. And so I need to review the total list of those 130 and whether Amnesty International was mentioned, but much of the same concerns do pervade with those organizations as well.
Yes, and Jordan, of course, looking towards, again, this potential ceasefire deal. Part of that could also see the release of the bodies of dead hostages. How significant is this as well?
Reopen many wounds that the Israeli public has continued to suffer from. Recently, there was a report whereby it disclosed details regarding the sexual assaults that many of the victims from the October 7th attacks and have since suffered, whether that be in captivity or beyond. It talks about very grotesque details, whether this report or others, about how women were shot in very sensitive areas, let's put it, before being killed, many of them suffering sexual assault in captivity. And unfortunately, we probably expect to hear more of horror stories, whether it be regarding sexual assault or torture, which will ultimately make many Israelis feel very disgusted with Hamas and its leadership, and ultimately want Hamas to be ejected from the Gaza Strip. And so it will also make many Israelis feel a strong need to make sure that the other hostages, the other 40, are returned home. And my understanding is that while Hamas is committing to returning 10 hostages, it's possible they might be considering the return of 18 deceased hostages. And so it will be a very painful day for the families of the victims who will be returning home in a casket. And it is my hope that Hamas and other militant groups in the Gaza Strip do not parade around the bodies like they did in celebrating fashion when it came to Eva Bibas and her children who were massacred in Hamas captivity, who were strangled to death. And so it will be a very painful day for Israel. And at the same time, some Israelis will be relieved that their friends and loved ones will be returning home alive.
Jordan Cope, thank you for that response. If you stay with us, we are going to continue in the Middle East, and a senior Israeli official says a ceasefire deal with Hamas could be possible within 1 or 2 weeks, but not immediately. The official confirms Israel will offer a temporary ceasefire, but if Hamas refuses to lay down arms, military action will continue. He also says enriched uranium in Iran remains at key sites, including Isfahan, Fordo and Natanz. Israeli intelligence confirms it wasn't moved before the strikes. They're removing it now. Would be extremely difficult. Well, Jordan, once again, thank you for staying with us. We've spoken about the Gaza ceasefire. I'd now like to shift our attention over to Iran. Intelligence saying that enriched uranium remains in Iran. Is this a signal of failure of the Israeli-US joint mission, which was hoping to wipe out Iran's nuclear program completely?
It's always very difficult to completely eliminate the nuclear program of Iran. I certainly would not say that it's a failure. It seems that some people have reported that it's possible that the enriched uranium deposit still exists and might have been moved. However, the centrifuges that have been destroyed and the infrastructure, whether that be in Fordo and Natanz and Isfahan, it will certainly at minimum put Iran back at least 1 to 2 years, likely when it comes to its ability to break out towards a nuclear bomb. And that in itself is a huge success, considering that intelligence estimates predicted that Iran was 1 to 2 weeks away, 2 weeks away from producing a nuclear weapon. And so Israel can be rest assured, at least for a little bit of time, that it can ultimately respond to Iran with the air superiority that it has established in this war. And in addition to that, the results have been quite significant in terms of Israel taking out IRGC leadership in Iran, taking out key military sites and establishing that much needed air superiority.
Yes, absolutely, Jordan. Let's move on now. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has praised the US military's show of force towards Iran during a meeting with Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth. He called the display the roar of two lions and said it was heard around the world. Netanyahu thanked CENTCOM and President Trump for their leadership, saying strength is the path to peace. Hegseth echoed the message, praising Israel as a model ally in a joint signal to Iran and the region. Here is what the Israeli Prime Minister said.
I think the entire world took note. I think Iran took note. And I think everybody in the Middle East took note of American resolve and of the strength of our alliance. And I think it was, frankly, it was like the roar of two lions. And it was heard around the world.
Well, we bring you some breaking news now. An air raid sirens rang out in Tel Aviv as the Israeli military reported that a missile launched from Yemen was intercepted. The Houthis, who control the most populous parts of the country, have been firing at Israel and attacking shipping lanes in recent weeks and months. This breaking news comes amid renewed efforts. The Houthis say that they are working in this manner in solidarity with Palestinians living in Gaza. And this, of course, leading to sirens and issues for civilians living in Israel. It is important to note that most of these Yemeni-based missiles that the Houthis have then claimed have not reached their target and have been shot down. Moving on now, and the US Embassy in Yemen says Houthi forces kidnapped crew members of the cargo ship Eternity Sea after attacking and sinking it in the Red Sea. The embassy confirmed some crew were killed and others taken hostage. Houthi spokesman Eyal Zamir claimed the ship was targeted with a drone boat and a missile after ignoring warnings. The US condemned the attack, calling it unprovoked terrorism. Another vessel, Magic Seas, was also hit. The Houthis continue strikes in regional waters, citing support for Gaza. Moving on now to North America, and US President Donald Trump has announced a fresh batch of tariff demand letters. Trump warns that new import duties would take effect in August for trade partners that fail to strike deals in Washington. Donald Trump outlined a 30% tariff on imports from Algeria, Libya, Iraq and Sri Lanka, a major industrial rival to the United States, while products from Brunei and Moldova would face a 25% duty and those from the Philippines a 20% levy. Similar to Trump's first batch of documents published on Monday, the tariff levels were not too far from those originally threatened in April, although some partners received notably lower rates this time. While the US president in April imposed a 10% levy on almost all trading partners, he unveiled and then held off on the higher rates for dozens of economies. Well, joining me to discuss this latest tariff action from Donald Trump is Professor Stephen Nagy from the International Christian University and a visiting fellow of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. Professor Nagy, thank you ever so much for taking the time to join us. What's the significance of these further letters that Trump has issued, of course, ahead of this new deadline of August the 1st?
So first, thank you very much for having me. What we think is happening is that the Trump administration is really trying to push as much of his economic strategy, which was largely based on tariffs, towards partners and allies within the region before August 1st. And the reason is simple. There's an important decision trying to understand if the Trump tariffs are actually legal under international law and domestic law. And once that's decided, I think that the counterparts will be in a different position in terms of resisting or accepting Donald Trump's stiff demands. At the same time, I think the Trump administration really is committed to recalibrating its economic and trade relationships with allies, adversaries, and competitors, and it's doing that in a manner of policymaking that could best be described as policymaking on steroids. He's been exceptionally active, erratic, tactical, and again, pushing forward to try and recalibrate trade relationships with many partners.
Yes, and Professor Nagy, of course, the the economic instability that we saw after Trump's Liberation Day announcement, where he stood with a board with tariffs on up to 70 nations, was massive. Do you expect that we're going to get a similar shift if trade deals can't be agreed with US and their key trading partners?
Well, it looks like the markets have calculated in the instability in many ways, understanding that the Liberation Day tariffs that took place were walked back, more than I think after a week, and I think the markets are looking at Mr. Trump and President Trump and saying, well, he has this maximalist approach to tariffs and his negotiating tactics, and eventually comes back down to earth for something much more minimalistic, but sufficient enough to placate, I think, the MAGA base. But that being said, I do think that there's specific countries that will be targeted and will continue to be targeted, in particular China, because it is seen as not only a competitor, but an adversary that has been, in the long term, abusive towards the American market. Other partners like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Southeast Asian countries, they're all better positioned vis-a-vis tariffs. And this may bring some stability to the markets, as I think the markets, again, are understanding that the US-China competition that is right now seen through tariffs and trade friction is structured. That means it's long-term and will continue to be with us, not just for Donald Trump's term as president, but in future administrations as well.
Yes, Stephen Nagy, if you stay with us, we're going to continue looking at tariffs, but with wider implications. Brazil and the United States have escalated their row over President Trump's support for coup-accused ex-leader Jair Bolsonaro. US President Trump has slapped a 50% tariff on one of its main steel suppliers. Trump has strongly criticised the prosecution of right-wing ally Bolsonaro, who was on trial for allegedly plotting to cling to power after losing the 2022 elections to Lula. In a letter addressed to Lula, Trump criticised the treatment of Bolsonaro in an international disgrace and said that the trial should not be taking place. He has even further said that Washington would launch an investigation into Brazil's trade practices. While Trump has been issuing letters to trading partners focusing on those his country runs a deficit with, Brazil had until now not been among those threatened with higher duties to come on August the 1st. Following Trump's move, Lula wrote on X that any unilateral tariff increases will be addressed in the light of the Brazilian law of economic reciprocity. Well, thank you, Stephen Nagy, for staying with us. This, of course, is a feud that has been rumbling for some time. Some parallels between Bolsonaro and Trump's own endeavours, of course, both accused with inciting potential violence after an election result, the US with the Capitol, and of course this alleged coup. What is the significance of this tariff? And is this Trump once again using tariffs as a weapon to try and get his own agendas across in the geopolitical sphere?
So I think there's several different layers of this argument. First, I think that President Trump does have an affinity for the former president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, feeling that he was attacked by the same kinds of narratives that the so-called liberal media attacked Mr. Trump very intensively for more than 10 years to try and prevent him from returning to the presidency. And I think that with that, he has a strong, an inclination to push back against what he understands as so-called liberal politicians and liberal media attacking politicians that have a similar background and political orientation. So I think this is part of the story. The second part of the story is that Mr. Trump is engaging in a global reset of how we think about trade, including important industries such as steel manufacturing, believing that he may be able to use this as an opportunity to further, bolster steel production within the United States and pull that away from countries like Brazil, but again, other countries that are major steel producers, to strengthen the American economy, but also, have a stronger geopolitical position vis-a-vis China. And the third, I think, is that Brazil recently hosted the BRICS summit, and the BRICS summit has been quite explicit in advocating multilateralism, advocating for a push away from the American dollar as the global reserve currency, and trying to decrease their dependence on the American market and the United States in general. And I think that the Trump administration sees this as highly anti-American, highly anti-Trump, and of course against their interest in making America great again. So I think at these three levels we can understand that the Trump administration does have a political side, they have an economic agenda side, and they're thinking about broad positioning of the United States in terms of a new international order where it doesn't have absolute power. It has to deal with a multipolar world in which China, perhaps the global south, perhaps Russia, perhaps Europe, are alternative hubs that make it more difficult for the United States to dominate an international order based on rule of law.
Yes, and I want to look at that point that you've just made there. Of course, Donald Trump positioning himself as the leader, of course, of Make America Great Again and putting America first. You've slightly touched on it there, but I'd like to expand on the opportunity that might open if America is just focusing on itself, specifically looking at trade. We saw after the initial announcements, Chinese President Xi Jinping going to Southeast Asian countries to talk about China potentially filling that gap and unity. Is this a potential shift away from American leadership and domination in certain sectors? And how do you think that shift could play out?
Well, over the long term, that we've seen a relative decline in U.S. power, not because the United States is actually getting weaker. It's that we've seen the rise of the rest, as Fareed Zakaria has talked about. China in 1991 was not really on the economic map. But today, it's the #2 economy. And the same can be said for India, Southeast Asia, and others. So it's not that the United States is really losing its absolute or comprehensive power, but there's other countries coming up being competitors. Is China and other countries able to fill the gap? Well, quite frankly, no. And I think that we see this over and over and over. When the Europeans want security guarantees, they're willing to boost NATO spending to 5%. And that is to placate the United States because they want to keep the United States within this loop. When countries want to deal with security challenges in the Indo-Pacific, where I'm based usually, again, they want the United States. When there's big trade agreements, they want the United States. So I think the United States is still seen as that indispensable partner or critical partner to really have credible security, economic, and other policies. And countries that are more or less allied with the United States are going to continue to want the United States in the region. And what we're seeing now is that rather than large-scale multilateralism like the G20 or BRICS or even the United Nations, the U.S. and partners such as Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, Australia are working in mini-lateral partnerships to achieve some of their objectives because they see large authoritarian states, whether it's China or Russia or others, fracturing multilateralism, making the United Nations Security Council not work, making ASEAN not work in terms of its consensus-based decision-making, and even the European Union in terms of finding a common ground on human rights issues. So I think, the United States, again, just to repeat, is still the most powerful country. It's still the indispensable country, and it's shifting its broader foreign policy to deal with the real challenges associated with authoritarian states.
Yes, Professor Nagy, if you stay with us, we are now going to move to Europe, and President Donald Trump is considering sending Ukraine an additional Patriot missile air defense system. The move would mark the first time his administration approved a major weapons system for Ukraine beyond what the Biden administration has authorized. Trump has expressed increasing frustration with Russian President Vladimir Putin and recently vowed to bolster Ukraine's defenses after a phone call on Thursday. As per reports, the White House has asked the Pentagon for options to send more weapons, including another Patriot battery. Ukraine has so far received 3 US-provided Patriot systems, 3 from Germany and 1 from a coalition of European countries. However, due to maintenance, not all systems are operational at once. The systems remain Kyiv's most effective defence against ballistic and cruise missile attacks. Well, Professor Nagy, thank you for staying with us. Let's look at the importance of these missile systems. We know conversations have been had. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has spoken about Germany's potential involvement in purchasing these systems from the US and then directly handing them to Ukraine. But this a signal that Donald Trump may make that step himself. This, of course, in the wake of a record number of drone attacks on Ukraine yesterday, reported by Ukrainian officials. I'm sure we will come to it, but further overnight strikes being reported on the capital, Kyiv, and other areas in Ukraine as well. So an intensifying of strikes from Russia, how significant is it for Western allies of Ukraine that they can defend themselves effectively?
Well, it's absolutely essential that the Ukraine can continue to defend itself against Russian aggression. And I think that in many ways that the Trump administration has been quite transparent about this. They said they would negotiate with the Putin government, and if there was progress, they would move towards a peace, some kind of peace settlement. But at the same time, they said that they would likely, arm the Ukrainians and give it the defense capabilities if Russia was not willing to negotiate it. And this is where we are today. I think it's part of Mr. Trump's MAGA agenda, but I think it's also part of the MATA agenda, make America and Mr. Trump great again. And I think when we think about this, Mr. Trump sees an opportunity to demonstrate strength, demonstrate leadership, but in a very targeted way by providing the Patriot missiles. The Patriot missiles are really meant to knock down incoming planes and larger missile systems from Russia or from whatever the adversary is. And these are not going to work well, and they're not really suitable for the kind of drone warfare that we're seeing on the front line. But they will be important in protecting the major capital, Kyiv, and some of the major cities from Russia attacks. The question for all of us as we think about this is the sustainability of using these systems to defend Ukraine. Ultimately, they have to be able to replace the anti-missile systems over and over a long time to dissuade the Russians from using these systems, or at least make their attacks on Ukraine much less effective.
Yes, absolutely. And let's look at that support from Western nations to Ukraine. Of course, the coalition of the willing, which is led by the United Kingdom and France, but a group of nations looking to support Ukraine. There has been conversation around the risks associated for Europe, but for the wider world, for the wider Western world, why, in your opinion, is it important, if it is, for them to repel this potential Russian advancement for geopolitical stability?
Well, I think, former Prime Minister Kishida Fumio from Japan said this at the 2022 Shangri-La Dialogue, that today's Ukraine could be tomorrow's East Asia. And he was referring to the fact that there's tremendous geopolitical challenges associated with territorial issues and, complicated relations such as the Taiwan-China relations. And that there's concern that, in particular, China would take the lessons from Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, that it could also use military power to either reunify with Taiwan or seize and control the South China Sea, which is a really, really important area for global trade. About $5.5 trillion of trade go through those sea lanes every year. So there's real concern that placating or accepting Russia's forced conquering of territory in Ukraine would be, an example for China. And this would have global ramifications if China were to do something similar over Taiwan or in the South China Sea. So in a sense, we have something called the interconnectivity of war, is that what happens in Europe actually matters to other parts of the world, including the Indo-Pacific, where I'm based.
Yes, absolutely. Professor Nagy, if you stay with us, we're staying in Europe, and Europe's top human rights court has ruled that Russia shot down Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 in 2014, killing all 298 people on board. The court said a Russian-made BUK missile was fired from rebel-held eastern Ukraine. Judges found the attack was intentional, likely mistaking the plane for a military aircraft. Russia has refused to take responsibility. The court also criticised Moscow for failing to properly investigate. The Kremlin has rejected the ruling, calling it void. Professor Nagy, thank you for being here. This, of course, a contentious situation where Russia are denying this claim that has been made by a top court. What's your opinion on this ruling?
Frankly, the ruling's not surprising. The evidence is strong, but it's about a longer track record of Russia actually, shooting down planes that are commercial planes. Remember, back in the 1990s, the Russians shot down a Korean airliner. The Malaysian airliner is part of a broader story of the Russians not having proper checks and balances in their systems, and this creates huge problems and security challenges for states that are flying through Russian airspace. And this will continue to be a challenge as long as Russia remains it's a current authoritarian state without rule of law, without transparency, and in this current belligerent form. There's no real way to enforce the decision of the European Union. All they can do is present the evidence and share that evidence with other countries, and then they can make decisions about how they engage with Russia and where they send their commercial flights through. But this will continue to be a challenge. Again, Russia is not a country that follows rules in the international domain, and that it still remains a country without rules and without transparency in terms of how law works.
Yes, absolutely. We will move on now. And I alluded earlier to some strikes that have been launched overnight. And there are reports that Russia has launched another deadly strike on Kyiv, wounding at least 11 people. Missiles and drones slammed into several districts, setting buildings and garages on fire. Blasts rang out overnight as air defences lit up the sky. Authorities have warned of ballistic missile threats and urged residents to stay in shelters. Kyiv officials asked citizens not to post images online. The escalation comes as US and Russian diplomats prepare to meet on the sidelines of ASEAN talks in Malaysia. Well, Professor Nagy, we have had reports from Ukraine that there have now been 2 deaths reported. This, of course, as mentioned earlier, coming after a record number of drone strikes. And it's not just Kyiv. I want to inform our audience. It's not just Kyiv that has been struck. Ukraine saying other areas in the country also being hit as well. What's the significance, Professor Nagy, of this intensifying nature of Russian strikes day after day, seemingly records being broken with the number of projectiles that have been fired? This, of course, reported by Ukraine.
So I think that part of this is retaliatory, and part of this is the strategic tactics towards negotiating with the United States and Ukraine in general. When I say it's part of retaliatory, remember back in June or May last month, the Ukrainians were successful in an audacious attack across Russia, hitting many of their long-distance strategic bombers, causing tremendous damage to Russia's ability to maintain its strategic bombing capabilities. And in that sense, I think that there's a retaliatory side demonstrating that Russia is fully capable of continuing to its attacks on Ukraine. At the strategic level, the Russians understand that they are, have an advantage in terms of quantity, and they're moving slowly on the front, whether it's centimeter by centimeter or more, and they're in a stronger position because of absolute numbers compared to the Ukrainians. But they want to maximize their position, their negotiating position, and weaken the resolve of the Ukrainians. And they're doing this by continuing to bomb. And they're hoping that this will put them in a maximalist position towards the United States and Ukraine in the negotiating structure, where they may be able to convince the Americans to convince the Ukrainians that There's no winning the war with Russia. There's only more death and destruction for the Ukrainians. And whether this is true or not, that's a different story. But this is the approach that the Russians will have, is to cause as much chaos and death and mayhem to try to create the conditions where the Ukrainians and the United States will say no. No more deaths, no more mayhem. We want to try and freeze the conflict or stop the conflict as soon as possible.
Yes, let's now look at that diplomacy that we briefly spoke about there. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio is set to meet with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Kuala Lumpur on Thursday as part of the ongoing ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. This will be their second in-person meeting following a similar encounter in Saudi Arabia earlier this year. The talks come at a time of heightened tensions, with US President Donald Trump expressing frustration over the prolonged war in Ukraine. Despite initial conciliatory efforts towards Moscow, Trump has recently criticised Russian President Vladimir Putin, particularly after authorising the shipment of defensive weapons to Ukraine. Rubio's visit to Malaysia is also part of a broader US initiative to strengthen relations with the Indo-Pacific. The meeting will be closely watched as both nations continue to navigate the complexities of US-Russia relations. Well, Professor Nagy, once again with us, thank you for staying here. These relations, of course, they flip-flopped, as Donald Trump often does with his rhetoric around Russia. On one side, he criticises Vladimir Putin, and the next time he praises his leadership. How do you think this relationship will move forward, and what's the significance of this meeting between Rubio and Lavrov after pretty strong language from Trump? But we know he sometimes can flip around his opinions depending on who he's spoken to last.
Well, I think it's important to understand that President Trump's, whether we call it flip-flop or otherwise, he tends to he doesn't really have a principled approach to the world. It's a very pragmatic approach where in his negotiation tactics, he may insult an ally and then compliment an ally within a very short period of time, which appears like he's flip-flopping. And I think that this is actually more tactical rather than a real sentiment either way. He just wants a deal. And however he gets to that deal is really, really important. A second aspect, I think, of this whole discussion is that, the Russians under Vladimir Putin have been very consistent. And whether it's Lavrov or other representatives of the Russian government, they all have worked with Vladimir Putin since the 90s. They are thick as thieves, as we'd say. And, there's no sunlight between these people. They all have the same worldview. They want to make Russia great again. In fact, they want to make a Russian empire great again. And I think that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the United States, needs to come into the discussions and understand that that is Russia's priority when they're engaged in the negotiation processes, that the Russians have a maximalist approach where they want to rebuild the Soviet Union. And even Vladimir Putin has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical mistake or casualty of the 20th and 21st century, and that as Rubio is engaging in this discussion, he must understand that, again, Lavrov is a peer of Putin, and they're determined to rebuild the empire, the Russian Empire. Where is the place for the United States to end the negotiation? Does Mr. Trump have an opportunity to push the boundaries here? I'm really not sure, and I just think that if there's a pause in the war, Russia will come back 5 years from now, because even if Putin's gone, the broader leadership in Russia shares the same objectives of making Russia great again.
Professor Stephen Nagy, I would like to thank you ever so much for your time and your insights on all those points of discussion. We will now move on, though, and we'll take a look at the latest from the world of business. Asian stocks edged higher on Thursday, buoyed by optimism from Nvidia's record $4 trillion market valuation. Investors appeared unfazed by US President Trump's new tariffs, including a 50% levy on copper imports and a threat against Brazil. While US copper futures spiked, market reactions to the tariff news were muted, with many anticipating future negotiations. The dollar softened and cryptocurrencies including Bitcoin, continued their upward momentum, maintaining near record levels. Despite the tariff news, expectations of Federal Reserve cuts helped keep markets stable. Bitcoin surged to a new all-time high of $111,998 late on Wednesday, just shy of $112,000 as institutional demand and a growing risk appetite fueled its climb. The cryptocurrency has gained over 18% this year alone, with major financial players increasingly adopting digital assets. Anthony Pompliano, CEO of Professional Capital Management, highlighted that Bitcoin's growing size actually reduces its risk, making it more accessible to global capital allocators. As Bitcoin soared, Ether also hit a one-month peak, and other crypto-related stocks followed suit. Sonova Energy has struck a $7 million deal to sell part of its residential solar business to Omnidian, following its recent bankruptcy filing. As part of the agreement, Omnidian will manage customer service and system operations for a large portion of Sonova's existing clients. This move comes amid increasing financial strain on the solar industry, driven by high interest rates and fading incentives, with Sonova's liabilities ranging between $10 billion and $50 billion. The US government is scrutinizing Chinese AI models for ideological bias, according to a memo obtained by Reuters. Officials from the State and Commerce departments have been testing Chinese AI programs like Alibaba's Qwen 3 and DeepSeek's R1, assessing how their responses align with Beijing's official narrative. The findings suggest these models are most likely to echo China's talking points, especially on sensitive topics like the Tiananmen Square protests and territorial disputes. The US is considering making these evaluations public to highlight potential risks posed by ideologically skewed AI tools. The French Competition Authority has launched an investigation into Meta's online advertising practices, accusing the company of abusing its dominant market position. The probe, triggered by a 2022 complaint from advertising platform AdLux, could take several months. Meta is already facing similar legal challenges in Spain, where over 80 media companies accuse it of unfair competition, and has been fined by EU regulators for breaches of antitrust law. Despite the investigation, the French authority stressed that no conclusions have been reached yet regarding Meta's liability. Well, that's all we have time for, but we will continue to bring you more of the latest breaking news from across the world.